Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking about the 1950s, and yet we're filming back to back because I have some personal stuff going on. I'm going to be away on vacation, so you're not going to be hearing me ranting about comments or anything like that, but you're going to hear about cool watches. So let's keep digging, and today we're going to talk about something super cool. The 50s, the innovations in the 50s, something that really marked that era, from every single brand to the designs to everything else that makes it stand out from every single other decade. We're gonna start with some classic watches. You're gonna see a lot of the watches from the 50s with different hairline dial designs. We would see that a bit back in the 30s, back in the 40s, but not as consistently as the 1950s. That hairline design, what that means, it's basically a cross. It's a line that crosses from 12 to 6 and from the 3 to the 9, and that creates a kind of division in the dial and also is pretty much unique to that era. Second thing, the most known watches were created back in the 1950s. If we start with the GMT from Rolex, if we go from the Speedmasters of 1957, the Seamaster is also 1957. The Railmaster was there, but it wasn't really the big hit that it actually needed to be. If we talk as well, anything that has to do with honeycomb dials, anything that's really highly textured dials from Rolex, from Tudor. If we talk of those dials, they're really common in that era. The 1960s and on, they kind of disappeared because it was very technical. It was very hard to read those dials because you had a texture that was up and down and the printing was not as perfect to the eye, and it was very illegible. The one watch that still remains right now is the Royal Oak by Audemars Piguet. It does have that feel of a patterned dial. So what happened is that they used to have smaller patterns. Now they're much bigger. They're very square instead of being almost a honeycomb type of look on their dials themselves. Very few watches have survived that kind of era or that kind of design nowadays, if we're counting the AP dial, but that's a 1970s watch, so it came out, 2 decades later. If we're looking at innovations, you're gonna see the 50 Fathoms from Blancpain with their innovations into diving, and then Rolex actually took over with more publicity and more, let's say, more advancement towards the popularity of those watches than ever before. Therefore, Blancpain was kind of put aside and Rolex took over. They're really good at marketing, so that's why we see the Submariner and every other watch that they subsequently made in the 1950s being, relatively more known than every single other brand that was doing quite amazing things back then. If we're looking at the 1950s as well in regards of the military innovations, obviously you're not going to see as a tumultuous time frame or time being for the military innovations. Therefore, you'll still see Lemania watches, you'll still see some Omega watches and other brands that were trying to do a lot of monopushers. So you'll see that from the 40s transitioning to the 1950s and maybe a bit in the 1960s, but there were no big innovations in the 1950s in regards to the military watches as there were in the 1940s, where you see a lot more variations, a lot of brands from Germany, from Switzerland, from the US being really attributed or being designed specifically for military use compared to the 1950s. So you do have that big discrepancy in creating new models for the military, but you see a lot of stuff happening in the US as well, South America, England, and so on. And most of the time what we're going to see is some Rolexes that are going to be either Submariners or some Tudors, for example the 7924, 7928, that were also used by the military. We've seen a few examples. For example, Kirill had one that was indicative of the US Navy back in the 1950s, and that's very relatable to the 1950s. So a lot less innovation in that part for the military, but lots of innovation for the everyday use, for people who would use them for leisure and for everyday diving, for example. When we're looking I'm gonna go through a few little details here. If we're going to the 50s, we're gonna see those honeycomb dials. You're gonna see different types of bezels from Rolex and from Tudor. I don't know what this bezel is called on this 7944. This is a personal watch, it's not for sale, but just to say they are really interesting when it comes to design. They would use a honeycomb dial, really nice legible type of 1269 dials. Some of them are 12369 depending what kind of movement. In this case it's a 395 Tudor, so the 395 denotes the fact that it has the date. When you're looking at a movement from Rolex, a little side note, as soon as it has a 5 at the end of the 4 digits of the movement, or 3 digits in the case of this one, you have a date. Okay, it's not always the case, but I'd say 99% of the case that's what it is. When we're looking at something like this design, it still remains very, very classic. The only thing we see here is that even though it's called a 34 millimeter, the case measures 35, which is denoting a bit of a discrepancy in the reference, or the reference on the dial versus the case itself. And that's kind of normal with Rolex. They had different variants, they were putting in different movements and similar or look-alike cases, but some of them are a bit smaller, some of them bigger. And in those cases as well, you do have plexiglass crystals on almost every single watch from the era. Everything is going to be plexi except maybe a few watches, but from my experience, it's almost 95-98% that. When we're looking at the design of the watch itself, we do see that Rolex and Tudor will keep the same design basically until the 2005, 2010 in most cases. Obviously now with the maxi cases, with different cases, they changed except on the Datejust, which they refined now with the later references compared to the Datejust 2, for example. But in general, we remain in the same look for the past 70 years, okay? There's nothing really that changed in the lineup. Obviously, Tudor as well has changed a lot in their classic lineup. They wanted to dissociate themselves from Rolex nowadays, but back then, until not too long ago, until 2010, 2015, you still see the same kind of idea and design overall on those watches. If we're looking as well in terms of more Rolexes, I have here a manual wound. This is going to be on the website. I believe it's a 6427 or 6227. I have to check exactly the reference, it's not listed yet, but this one is a manual wound. They were using both manual wounds and automatics back in the 50s with Rolex, and this was actually previously sold by Coin Watch Co. in Toronto. I ended up getting it, I think, a few months ago from the person who actually bought it. Super cool watch, very nice design. In the middle, you have almost a bullseye type of dial, but it doesn't look like it until you really see it in your face. And you have basically a honeycomb dial in the center, and on the side, most of the dial is actually flat with square markers at 369 and the crown at 12 o'clock, and then arrowheads for everything else. Rolex was trying different designs, different dials, and it was super cool back in the time. The 1950s are really, really remarkable in terms of innovations for the dials themselves. It's more of a decade that was, let's say, more subdued. It wasn't as much about showing off post-war. In general, in the 1950s, consumers were a lot more conservative with the purchases and the designs that were also created in that regards. Doesn't mean that the innovations were not there. I'm gonna go as well to here a Vacheron Constantin. This one is on the website. What's cool about it is that you're gonna have a design which is called a disco volant, which means that you have a huge bezel. Those are really typical of the 1950s. If you're looking at Universal Genève, if you're looking at Rolex, at many other companies, they were all trying to imitate or mimic each other in terms of design, and this is one of the very classic designs from the time. You won't see a lot of Cartier, for example, from the 1950s. You won't see a lot of those floating around. They came back mostly in the 1960s and the 1970s. So It was a very, very different time in that era or that decade. If you're looking at something that's really classical, you have Jaeger LeCoultre or GG LeCoultre, if you want in French, and you have here a design that was basically used by Vacheron Constantin and by GG LeCoultre. I believe the Jaeger themselves were creating the same movements for both companies. There were different names to them, but we have here a rose gold triple date watch with the almost timeless design in terms of triple dates. They also come with the moon phase. I yet have to find one either in stainless steel or in rose gold like this one. I'd like to own one myself. They're super, super cool watches, and when it comes to that design, it's very, very indicative of the 1950s as well, with those stepped side cases. Almost everyone right now tries to mimic those 1950s designs when they're trying to imitate the teardrop lugs, those stepped sides on the case, and then those big subdials when we're looking at the 6 o'clock subdial for the seconds. Okay, it's really, really indicative of the 1950s, and a lot of Japanese producers right now or even micro brands are going to try to replicate a variant of those watches. The only thing, a lot of those movements are a lot thicker, so you'll not have such a good balanced case overall. I find that the new watches that try to replicate those designs are much bigger in most cases, or if they really are in-house or they're made by a very high-end watchmaker, the prices are just out of range for 99% of the population out there who would actually want something like this. So they still remain somewhat affordable. Maybe you can find them under $6,000-7,000 US, which is still a very good watch for the era. And depending on the condition, again, you can score big if you find a mint one, because this is harder and harder to find. Again, when I'm talking scoring big is adding a really good watch to your collection. The 1950s were also perpetuating gift ideas from companies. We see that a lot, for example, with the Eaton watches. I have one here from 1961. It's borderline, but they were still giving them even in the 1950s. So this is a Bombay. It's called Bombay because it's the idea of it being a bit like a dome type of case. So you're gonna see the design here. It's very, very flowy from one side to the other. And you have the Bombay, which sounds a bit Indian, but we do have the Bombay that comes from French, that comes from that design period, okay? And what we see here is a Eaton Bombay case, which denotes almost an identical design to the Paul Rotter from Universal Genève. A lot of people don't know about those watches because they were mostly given, or 100% of them actually were given in Canada, for people who used to work for Eaton, the defunct retail store. We had a retail store in Canada that was in Toronto. I believe in Montreal we had a huge one. Now it's only the building that remains, and we have some other distributors. I think there were 3 or 4 stores, I think, across Canada. What happens with the Eaton watches is that they mostly use those cases, or they were also giving pocket watches. You had the choice as an employee to choose either one or the other. What's cool about them, they're also indicative on the back of the serial number of the watch gift or gifted to the employee. In this case, we have a number 9764, and the person had worked from 1936 until 1961. It's very, very classic in a time where companies would actually be a bit more human to actually give watches like this one to their employees after so many years of service. And it's very, very interesting to actually own a piece of history. Someone gave 25 years to a company, even maybe more, and he got gifted this watch, and it still survives today. And this is something that was very common in Canada, in the US, maybe a bit less in Europe, but it was quite common here. And a lot of the times we're gonna see better brands like Rolex or Tudor. That was a gift. If we're talking of hairline dials, because I want to showcase a few of them right here, have a 1956 Constellation, and here we have a two-tone hairline. We call those the tuxedo dials by Tudor. We also see them in the Universal Genèves. Obviously, in the 1950s, it's most probably the most common watches that you'll see with those hash marks on the dial, and it's really cool for the time. What I really enjoy about those is that they're extremely classic. They will remain, again, very timeless. And even now, I believe Omega tried to remake something similar, but Tudor has actually kind of lost his way in the design, and we're nowhere close to this anymore. So if you want to find a tuxedo watch, you're gonna find something like this from the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s from Tudor. But I find them really, really, really nice. And although I don't own one personally, I own a different variant of something very similar to this, but it's gonna be for another time. What I'm also saying is that anything that has to do with the 1950s is very classic. It will remain in history, and a lot of the companies are just going back again and again to what was previously done to accentuate their history and everything else. And if we don't understand what's going on here, we don't really understand why those remakes are really so attractive to the eye, is because those were there back then. The next watch that I want to show you is the Geometer by Rodania. I talked about this watch in a previous video. It's a super cool design, and you do see here it's an exact identical dial from a 1957 Speedmaster. The 2915 was actually using the same dial as those. Obviously not the same movement, not the same marking at 12 o'clock indicating the company name, but you'll see an exact dial from one to the other. Only thing, this came in 1954, so you have a radium dial, and a lot of those aged very well. I don't know why they aged very, very, very well compared to the Speedmasters that come after that. I don't know why Zinger or Bayer, I don't know who made the dial for those. They were so good. They were not aging as poorly as any other one that came after. And I find that those 2915 dials are just impeccable in many ways. There's two main differences. You have a dial that's identical to the 2915, and then you have a dial that, instead of being a bit more stepped towards the subdials, it just finishes flush. So I don't know which one came first, but I do suspect that the first variant came first. That's a bit more crude in a way. It's not as refined as the second version of the Geometer. I have both, so I have three of them right now in my collection. One of them is tropical, and then I have those two that are fully black with perfect patina, with everything. That's super, super cool. I do like the fact that actually Omega share the same dial as these. They wouldn't be as famous if they didn't, and they're really hard to get, so I'm really proud to own a few. And they're mostly found in Canada. I don't know why, obviously because we had a distribution here, or most of them were actually maybe ordered for here. And if we're talking of Rodania, we do have here a really mint 4449H military watch. This one does not have a engraving on the back, but I do still think it is a military watch in every single way. And this one happens to have a perfect dial that is radium. It's the most immaculate Rodania from the era that I've ever found. When I got it, the crystal had been cracked and the mono pusher here was missing. I was lucky enough to have the exact same size as the original pusher, the cap alone, and everything else was there. Super simple. It was put back together. Those watches are not for sale, by the way, but they're part, I believe, of the most important era of Canadian military. I do have some Tudor military watches as well, and they're really, really interesting to see and to own. Just to finish with Rodania, they made so many different watches, yet they're really renowned for maybe 3 or 4 different models And I think that those are the most common ones that we will see in the 1950s. And obviously the design is again very, very classic from that period. If you're looking at the Speedmasters from the time, you'll also find that the design is very unique to the period. You'll see most of the time straight lugs, so you have no twisted lugs, a bit like the 1965, the 145012 that appeared a bit later compared to the Ed Whites and previous models. Therefore, you'll see a different pattern of designs changing, and they were trying things, and they were also very, very indicative of what companies were trying to do. They were trying to share stuff together, yet also divide their knowledge and their designs throughout what they could come up with. You have Gerald Genta that was designing watches back then. Obviously, you'll see the twisted lug design from Tudor to Universal Genève and to many other companies that will be transient over many, many, many years. That's very important to understand, that even if it's an era that's a bit darker in terms of whatever design you might think, they were really trying very hard. And the 1960s for me is my preferred era. Obviously, a lot of colors were added to the dials, a lot of things were coming true slowly. And then the 1970s, it was an explosion of more designs and more bold designs than ever before. We can see a very nice linear design period from the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and so on. And today we're kind of trying to recreate all that golden era of watches themselves. Obviously, a lot of people tell me that they prefer brand new watches, they don't like vintage, there's so many stories or whatnot that you have misconceptions of what's going on. But that's why I do prefer that era, because right now we're clinging to those really nice designs that were made in the past. With today's technologies, I don't say it's not better. In many cases it is, but at the same time, what was done before is an indicative or where we're going in the future. And we're clinging very, very hard to those designs because they're so timeless, they're so perfect. There are a time where everything was drawn by hand, there was no computers, there was nothing like this. And to have someone like Gerald Genta draw on a piece of paper watch and the next day becoming an icon for, you know, another 50 years or 60, 70 years, it's very, very impressive to see and to respect. This is what this whole industry is about right now. Disregarding the fact that there are a lot of companies right now that are just looking to grab your money, and that's okay. It's a consumer-based, business-based relation, okay? But at the same time, we're looking in the past, and a lot of companies are basing themselves over what was done before. If we're looking, for example, at a 2023 Speedmaster right here that I have on my desk, there's not much difference from the 1950s to today in terms of design, especially from the dial aspect. Obviously, some changes in the hands, but the major idea is still there. And then you compare a 1954 watch and you see how much of a similar design we have between the two. And that's what's important. We're coming from somewhere and we're heading in a parallel add-on dimension to what we did before. And I think that this will help you choose what you really want in the future, to actually look in the past for your collection and for what you really need to buy as a collector. Okay, I hope you like the video. The next video I want to talk about the 1960s. It's my favorite decade, and there are so many watches out there that are exceptionally well made. They're highly collectible, they're really interesting in every single point of view. From the early 1960s to the 1970s, there were so many things that were done, so many things that were designed or enhanced, if we're talking from the Speedmaster to so many other things. If you really did enjoy the video, please comment Rodania, and we will talk about more watches in the next video. If you do have any questions about any of those watches or about any 1950s watches, please comment as well. I wish you a great week and have a great day.